everyone. Is this working fine? Everyone can hear me? Great. So welcome to this panel. This is our first time doing a stop on our Normalizing Dissent tour, so we're really excited. I'm going to be doing a little bit of a dual role here. I'm a little bit of a moderator, but I'm also participating in the panel itself. But before we start, I wanted to first of all thank you, Sean, and the Secular Students and Skeptics Society for hosting us. This is amazing, and we really want to be part of this conversation, and we really want to be talking to students. So it's awesome that we're here and for all the work that they've put through to make this happen. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about Ex-Muslims of North America. We are a 501c3 registered nonprofit, and we exist to serve the needs of ex-Muslims. Some of you might not know who ex-Muslims are, what that means exactly, but it's people who used to believe in Islam, former Muslims who left the religion. Ex-Muslims in North America exclusively serves non-theists, that is people that have left, no longer adhere to any sort of religion. We build communities, we advocate for the acceptance of religious dissent, and we aim to reduce discrimination that's faced by ex-Muslims and those who leave Islam. And this topic today, modesty, Islam, and feminism, is kind of a hot topic. You guys probably noticed, if you've seen the hijab, especially, as something that's very central to the debate about Islam. And there's this idea that there is maybe a little bit of a conflict there. So what we're hoping with the Normalizing Dissent tour is to touch on topics like this. And here today I have two wonderful panelists, Ghada and Hiba, and they're going to be telling you a little bit about their perspective on the issue and how we can move forward in this debate. So without further ado, I'm going to give them just a little bit of time to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about their story, then I'll share mine, and then we'll move forward to the discussion. Afterwards, there'll be a question and answer session. So as you think up of something you might be curious about, please let us know, and then we'll move on to that towards the end. So, Ghada, I'll let you begin.
Hello, everyone. I think I have mine. You guys hear me pretty well? You have your All right. So my name is Ghada. Okay, sorry about that. How about now?
You can take mine.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ghada. I was born, raised, and I grew up also in the Eastern Province in Saudi Arabia. I was born to devout Muslim parents. Both my parents were educated. My mother, for example, was a doctor, and my father lived 7 years in the United States doing his degrees, and my grandfather as well. When I was a young child, I was never given choices when it came to religion. Everything was a commandment. For example, in the first grade, I was taught to pray. When I became a little older, around second or third grade, it was compulsory now for me to pray on my own. And when I didn't pray, there was punishment. When I was in the second grade, the same thing with fasting. And when I reached the age of 9, hijab was also compulsory. Whenever I asked my mother, for example, why did I have to wear the hijab and my brothers didn't have to, she told me that it was a commandment from Allah, it was wajib, and therefore there was no question about it, it was no choice. I had to do it. It wasn't that somebody forced me to do it, it was because Allah said I had to do it, therefore it's not a choice. That's what my mother used to tell me. And it wasn't just the hijab as in the cloth that you put on your head. No, I had to wear long sleeves, and if just a little bit under the wrist would show, that was horrible. I remember on a very hot day in Saudi Arabia, as I was riding in the car with my mother, my sleeve came up to just about here, and my mother looked at me in disgust. I told her, well, Mom, it's hot. And she told me, well, Jahannam is hotter. The same thing about what type of clothes you wear. It has to be loose, it has to be plain, it has to fall to a certain degree. If you're wearing, for example, a shirt, the shirt has to go a little bit to your knee or just a little bit above the knee. So it was all of these things that came along with it. It wasn't just, put the hijab on, just whatever, and wear whatever you want. It was never that. Of course, no makeup. If I had to wear makeup, I had to cover my face. After a while, they relaxed with that for some odd reason. But other things that were mandatory was you couldn't question anything in the Quran. When I began reading the Quran yearly, especially during Ramadan, since I would like to say around middle school, I was, I think, in the 7th or 8th grade. And things like magic, that was supposed to be fact because the Quran mentions that magic is real, therefore magic is fact. Things like sex before marriage, that was haram, that was a grave sin, and that should never be something that you practice. All of these things were taught to me as this is what you're supposed to do and you cannot deviate from them. I also never grew up with music. Music was also haram. So I never had the boy band crushes growing up. I never had a CD or listened to music on my own because I was so afraid that my parents would find out. To give you an example of how extreme they were, if we were to watch a movie or a TV show and the opening theme comes up, we would mute the TV because that was music. It was that bad. I wasn't introduced to music until much later when I began to question religion. And I began to question religion when I was in high school. And what made me question religion was reading the Quran and finding out the difference in how the Quran reacts to women and reacts to men, how the Quran addresses women and how it addresses men. And it seemed to me while I was reading the Quran is that when women are addressed as a way of how should men treat women, how should men go about their lives with women, how they should control them, how they should discipline them, and of course what women should be wearing, what they should do, etc. But it was so unfair to me, and that was the start of it. And I came to the United States to study. I actually studied like right across the street from here in Colorado School of Mines. And I graduated, and during that time from when I was studying there is when the questioning really began to surface more and more, and experiencing freedom and experiencing being able to make a choice, being able to choose whether I want to wear the hijab or not, being able to choose who I talk to, whether it's a boy or a woman or a girl. All of that, along with meeting people from all different backgrounds, that is what led me in the end to think that maybe Islam isn't the one true religion. I mean, it can't be that all of these people are going to go to hell and only us, me, my family are going to go to hell. And before you begin to tell me that, oh, you grew up in Saudi Arabia, your parents are probably Salafi. No, my parents were not Salafi or Wahhabi. My parents actually abhorred them. My parents thought that they were too extreme. And the funny thing is, my parents were actually considered to be liberal in the sense because they let me study abroad, they let me study what I wanted, and they let me also work in a non-segregated environment when I was in Saudi Arabia. And that just gives a short intro about me. And now I will hand this mic to Hiba.
My name is Hiba. My background is actually very similar to Ghada's, so I will try not to repeat any of the things that she said and touch upon different things. I'm Lebanese. My parents come from one of the most religiously conservative societies in the world, I think. The Shia demographic in Lebanon, affiliated with Hezbollah, blah, blah, blah. As a child, I was also, raised with the idea that my purpose and my goal as a human being was basically to please Allah and to basically follow these commandments, these edicts for what they imagined to be a good life. Like Ghada, I had to start wearing hijab when I was a prepubescent child. I started around 8.5 because the Shia jurisprudence unilaterally dictates that hijab is mandatory for girls from the age of 9 lunar years on, and this is absolutely not disputed in the scholarship. I ended up wearing it for exactly 15 years. I didn't take it off until I moved here to the US because I kind of didn't have the chance to before that. So when I was growing up in Beirut, and going to school, blah, 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 basically everything that I was allowed to do and be and want had to somehow be circumscribed around my identity as not just a Muslim woman, but as a Muslim woman who subscribed to this doctrine of purity. So Ghada mentioned that the hijab is not just like a piece of cloth. It's not just a type of clothing. There is a normative aspect to it. Coming with the hijab is an entire doctrine of modesty, which has elements that have to do with not just, the requirements for the clothing, like Ghada mentioned, long, loose clothing, somber colors, covering everything but the hands and the face, no zina, anything decorative, no makeup, no jewelry that stands out, etc., etc. But it also had to do with how you conducted yourself from moment to moment in your daily life. So as a hijabi, I and my sister, all the women around me in our community, we were expected to behave in certain ways. That meant that almost anything that we were doing with our families and just socially in the community was, gender segregated. If we ever had some kind of social event, and I'm talking about outside of the regular religious services, generally if it was in a lecture hall like this, it would be half the room divided into women, half the room divided into men. Sometimes with a curtain between, sometimes not. Even things like house visits, when we had just family over, and not even super extended family, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins. The women would sit on one side of the room and the men would sit on the other side of the room. I was basically allowed to go to school/work and come back home, and not really do anything else. I wasn't allowed to have friends with men. And it was the type of thing where you can have pure interactions with members of the opposite sex, but only insofar as it's as much as you need to for your work or for school or whatever. Not going out for lunch or being friends or whatever. Just the concept of being friends with a guy was just, there was this almost unholy stigma attached to it. When it came to the clothing and stuff like that, it wasn't just about how we dressed, it was also about how we bore ourselves, our comportment. So we had to always be hyper aware of the way we were seated and the tone of our voice. Don't speak too loudly. Don't sit in ways that will show the shape of your body. Don't bend over to pick something up. And in those ways, by following all the kind of the directives for proper, modest conduct, it ends up, if that's not something you actually want to do and want to subscribe to, it ends up being extremely limiting and controlling. It ends up being that you can't study what you want and have friends with who you want and talk about what you want, because so many topics are, it's shameful for women to talk about them. You never, I grew up, the word sex was never mentioned at home. I never had any sex education, and everything I learned was from books and the internet. There was no reasonable expectation of privacy, because the whole patriarchal concept that I was supposed to be my father's daughter until I became my husband's wife, and until my father kind of handed me off to my husband. There was nothing that I was that I did or read or said that my parents didn't feel that they were privy to. And so it was the type of thing where I grew up without privacy. I wasn't allowed to close my room. I wasn't allowed to use the internet without supervision. I'm talking as an adult. I'm talking as, a grad student. I'm talking about as, I would go to school and I would have this position of almost authority and respect, where I'm standing in front of a classroom and teaching, and then I come home and I can't do a single thing without the permission of my parents. Now, the reason that this was the case had a lot to do with the jurisprudence itself, had a lot to do with the rules that were normalized, that were normative in our community, but it also had to do with just the way that the kind of the social institutions surrounding my existence were structured. Because if I had wanted to, say, not wear hijab, or if I had wanted to, to study something different, or if I had wanted to have friendships with men or boys, or if I had wanted to go places and do things, I wouldn't have been able to. I know because I tried, and it did not end well at all. And it took me a while to kind of really understand just how involved all the mechanisms of constraint were. And that's really what it comes down to. When we talk about whether or not you are free to engage in a bodily choice such as hijab, the problem isn't so much hijab and the doctrine surrounding it. If that's something that someone really believes in and thinks that that's the best way for them to conduct themselves, that's fine, it's great, and everyone should be given the chance to do that. The problem was with how little effective choice there is surrounding it, especially for Muslim women all over the world. And the thing is, like Ghada mentioned that you might think that, oh, you grew up in Saudi Arabia and it's different there and they're extremist, blah, blah, blah. Well, setting Saudi Arabia aside, the funny thing is, whenever people are talking about whether or not it is true that millions upon millions of women worldwide are constrained into modesty doctrines, they tend to focus on really superficial legal aspects. They go oh, well, the only countries where it's actually mandatory to cover your hair in public or cover your body and hair in public are Saudi Arabia and Iran. And that kind of foregoes just even the concept that there are other forms of institutional oppression, that along with the legal, there's the extrajudicial. There are all sorts of social mechanisms. So growing up in the Shia demographic in Lebanon happens to be a very, very sectarian country where we have something called personal status laws, such as the sect of your birth dictates exactly which laws apply to you when it comes to civil matters. So who I could marry, of what sect, etc., and things like inheritance laws and stuff like that. All of that was basically dictated by my sect of birth, basically I had different legal rights and privileges based on my sect of birth than a Sunni would, or than a Christian would, or than a Shia man would, or than a Christian woman would, etc., etc. Basically based on my gender and my sect of birth. So there's that type of constraint. And there's also the constraint that you have in Lebanon, a situation where an Islamist militant group, Hezbollah, happens to be kind of like a 3-in-1 semi-state. Yeah, they have the militant section, but that's almost no one's concerned about that inside the country. And then there's the fact that the schools and the clinics and just almost anything that you would want to get done socially when you belong to that community goes through Hezbollah. They have this power over you, such that, even if my family had been accepting me, even if I had wanted to just move out of that community, live somewhere else in Lebanon, just live my life the way I want, I couldn't. And I know because I tried. I tried to leave home when I was 18. We're legally in Lebanon. I'm an adult. It doesn't matter because Hezbollah has extrajudicial power. They literally hunted me down and brought me home. And I was basically kept home for almost the entire next year. And there are other cases, we hear the stories all around that, in a Shia village in South Lebanon or whatever, a girl seen walking down the street without her hijab at night, picked up and taken back to her father's house because we don't have girls who walk the streets at night. So there are extrajudicial forces, there are legal forces, and there's all these social constraints. We lose everything when we step out. We often, our ability to go to school, to work, to get married, all sorts of stuff like that hinges upon our compliance to the basically the performative standards of our gender in our communities. And there are so many women who are stuck in insular communities where they may or may not really want to be doing all of these things, like these strenuous acts of worship, whether or not they actually believe in them, dress in a certain way, behave in a certain way, do certain things, but they know that they're not going to be able to get married. They know that there is going to be all this pressure on their family. There's this concept of honor where basically your access to a good life hinges on your family's social standing, and your family's social standing hinges upon the conduct of its women. And so you're bearing all of the burden of your brothers and your father, your uncles, and they all say, you would shame us. And so I wore the hijab for years. When I was a closeted atheist, I frankly didn't believe in it. And I was just always hiding everything that I actually thought and felt. It felt like I was lying with every movement, lying with what I was wearing, lying with my actions, because I would pray in front of them. I would pray even though I didn't believe in God. Fasting in Ramadan, and it's just avoiding all the questions about who I saw and what I did and what I ate and what I talked about at school that day, blah, blah, blah. Okay, sorry, I'm going on too long. Let's
Yeah, because you're touching on a lot of topics. Can you hear me? This mic doesn't work, I feel like.
The other one works.
Yeah, but then it's just this passing back and forth. Hiba was touching on a lot of topics that I wanted to get in depth with the questions, but I realized that I never actually introduced myself, but my name is Sarah. I am a writer, I'm an activist, and I co-founded Ex-Muslims of North America a couple of years ago, and I've been working with them ever since. And just to keep my story short, it's not as exciting as theirs, but I was born in Pakistan and I was raised in Texas. And my family is what I would consider truly liberal from a Muslim perspective. So relative to Christians, they weren't very liberal, but relative to other Muslim families, I think my family was quite lenient. I was never forced into wearing the hijab. Although there was a variety of ways in which modesty as a whole was enforced, but I would say that my family was relatively liberal and relatively lenient. I left the faith when I was 16 or 15, but I was quite young when I decided that it just didn't make a lot of sense to me, and I just didn't feel like God or the idea of this morality made a lot of sense, so I left the faith, and I found that I was quite alone when I did. I didn't know many other people like myself. We might touch on this, but we might not. But it's within Muslim communities, which are quite close knit. It can be difficult for people who leave the faith to find others like us, because you just don't want to open up and talk about this because there's such a stigma to apostasy as a whole. So I didn't know any ex-Muslims, and I just didn't really want to have that conversation. I kind of hid my apostasy from my family and my friends. But after graduating, I co-founded Ex-Muslims of North America because I found that that when I first did meet the first ex-Muslim out in the wild, it was such a validating experience. It made me feel like, okay, I'm not that crazy, I'm not that weird, that this is rational, and this is okay, and it's okay to be like this. And it was such a uplifting experience, and we started to have these events, private events for ex-Muslims only, and we had all these security measures to make sure that we kind of knew the person before they were allowed into the events, and they were not publicly posted or in any kind of location that might put us in danger. And so we started holding these events, and we found that people were driving from 8 hours away one way just to come to a 2-hour happy hour, essentially. And there would be people who would just break down in tears every time because of some conversation they'd be having with another person that really resonated with them and reminded them of some of the things that they had went through. So we realized that this is a need that needs to be filled some way. And so we started Ex-Muslim in North America. We started fostering these communities, these local communities all across the United States and Canada, and now we have I think 18, something like that, quite a few all across the United States and Canada, and we're really proud of that, and we're hoping to give ex-Muslims who are often, that we're often in the closet, and we borrow a lot of language from the gay rights movement, but we use the terms in the closet to mean that we're not open with our family and friends about our lack of faith, because you don't want to face what comes after. So due to that, there's a sense of isolation, and we were hoping that our communities can resolve some of those issues, can give a little bit of comfort to people who are otherwise just in very tricky situations where you have to pick of whether you want to be true to your conscience, or whether you want your family and friends in your life supporting you, and if you want that community. So we were hoping to give them a little bit of leeway, a little bit of comfort in this scenario, and hopefully to empower them, because they knew they had us, they knew they had a community, empower them to speak out so that they wouldn't lose everything if they did decide to speak out. Their family might not talk to them, their former Muslim community might refuse to contact them anymore, but they might know a few people through our communities who would have their back and support them. One of the things that we've encountered since we've been talking about ex-Muslims and trying to educate the public and Muslim communities about this issue is that the political climate has really made this a very difficult position to hold. And I'm sure many of the people in this room are aware, but this is a very politically hostile climate, especially when you want to have an honest and nuanced conversation about practically anything, but in particular about Islam and about women's rights in particular to Islam. And I found that there's just this dichotomy where it's a lose-lose situation on both the political left and the political right, where on the right, there's a sense that, okay, well, we need to combat Islam and this threat of Islam, and there's no thought put into Muslims as a people and having compassion for them as a people and for standing up for their civil liberties. There's a sense that we need to do anything that we can do to combat this threat, and if that means that some Muslims get their civil liberties taken away, well, then that's a price we're okay with paying. And of course, this is something that is, seems disgusting to me as somebody who has Muslim family members and friends who I love and care deeply for. I certainly wouldn't want them to lose any of their rights as citizens in this country. So that part of the political aisle, I feel like, is just there's just a lot of toxic concepts which we just need to just shed as we move forward. And then with the political left, there's a sense that, well, we need to protect Muslims from anti-Muslim bigotry. We need to do what we can to protect them, and if that means that we have to just look the other way when it comes to certain issues, then that's what we'll do. Sometimes it gets to be a little bit more perverse, and I've seen this especially when it comes to women's rights and to the hijab in particular, where there's a sense of, well, all that matters is that it's a woman's choice, and then there's many hijabis who, for them, it was a choice, and then they're very public and they're very outspoken about the fact that it was a choice for them, and the conversation kind of just ends there. But of course, that's not the whole story, because there are many, hundreds of millions of women across the world in Muslim communities who don't really have much of a choice. Could you say the analog, I guess, that I use for this is, would you have said that an American woman in the 1950s was as free to work outside of the home and just be a single mother as she was to be a homemaker? And you would have, of course, women in the 50s who would say, well, it's my choice to be a homemaker. I want to raise children. I want to be a mother, and this is the role that fits me. Well, of course, that it might very well be the choice that she would have made anyway. But in that atmosphere, could you have known? Would you say that atmosphere was truly one where free choices are easy to make? So this is obviously a difficult climate, and one of the things that we wanted to address with this tour is to bring ex-Muslims, people who have something to lose with sort of both sides of these extremes. We wanted to shed light on some of these issues, talk about trying to get into the nitty-gritty of the ways that this affects Muslims and non-Muslims alike. And so, to start off, I think we covered hijab quite a bit, but
Can I piggyback off something you said? Is
Sure.
this working? I can't tell. No? Yes?
No,
Yeah?
you have to do this one.
Right. Part of the huge struggle of trying to bridge that gap or have the kind of middle course between the bigotries of the left and the bigotries of the right is that essentially we're not talking about this because we want to tear down Islam or Muslims. We're talking about this because we actually care about the rights and freedoms of people, and especially women, in insular religious communities. And the thing is, the thing that gets me is that when we get this kind of like response from the left that like, oh, but you know, they're talking about in quasi-defense of hijabis, and the thing is, it's just like, you know what, you are not going to be more concerned about this than I am about my hijabi mother and my hijabi sister, and I personally know what it's like to be discriminated against and stigmatized because of the hijab. I'm the one who walked around wearing hijab for 15 years, and there's this, and the funny thing is that, like, you know, if you care about a hijabi who gets verbally assaulted on public transportation, you should also care about the hijabi who gets beaten by her father because she got caught texting a boy in class. And if you only care about one and not the other, and not just that, if you deny that the second one happens and just talk about it as if it's some kind of racist myth, as if we don't have the same kind of like structures of conservatism and patriarchy as almost every other society on this planet, then I mean, it's just. Then you care more about, I guess, being performative, about being progressive than you do about what's actually going on with these women, especially when you are constantly orienting yourselves towards, and I mean, forgive me for this, but it's the truth, towards the women who have the most privilege and platform and voice, the ones who are the kind of like proud, free-speaking, open hijabis who consistently talk about how it's something that they're not coerced into, and blah, blah, blah. The thing about that is that, of course, you're only and ever going to be hearing from the voices that are already approved of and celebrated and uplifted from within their own cultural zeitgeist, from within their own cultural community. That's why these are the voices on the front line of just talking about Muslim issues. The girls and the women who are suffering under purity norms and patriarchal norms, they don't have the platform and the capacity to say, this isn't my choice, and I'm being constrained into these things. Because of it, as a function of their very constraint, as a function of everything they stand to lose because of that visibility. So we're already invisible, and then this kind of like well-meaning attempt to sanitize everything involving the potential oppression of women in the Muslim world. And let's be real, women are oppressed all over the globe. It's not something specific to Muslim communities, but there are particular ways in which it manifests in the Muslim world. And we can't remedy those aspects unless we talk about them.
Can I just say one more thing? So Hiba mentioned something about denying that, you know, the woman that gets beat up because her father caught her texting a boy. It's not just the denying part. It's the part where, for example, when I go and speak to somebody who's like, yeah, but that's not the story for every Muslim woman or every ex-Muslim woman. It's like, I know that. I know. I come from an extreme background. My parents were extreme, and I understand that. But I also knew a lot of others from non-extreme backgrounds that went through something very similar, where even though she didn't wear hijab and she was able to travel and whatnot, when story was broken or rumors got out that, you know, she was dating a boy, she was put back home, she was beaten, and a few months later, and she was beaten, and then she was put back home, and we never heard from her again. And that person was my cousin, and another person was a friend of mine, and another person was somebody that I just heard of. These people exist in our communities, and when somebody is told, it's like, yeah, but that's just, you know, an outlier. That just, you know, happens to 1 in a million. It's like, no, it doesn't. This happens in almost every household, even households that are liberal in the Muslim sense. It happens. The purity culture is very serious.
Well, I guess I wanted to ask a different question, but this is just where the conversation is flowing, so we'll just go with it. To add to what Gada said, it's not so much that because I did grow up in a liberal background. I didn't have super coercive parents, and you know, now I still have contact with them, and weirdly proud of me. I mean, it's a strange thing. Was on the one hand they're very ashamed, and on the other hand they're kind of like, oh well, she's making a name for herself, so I guess that's good. I know that they're in a really tough spot, and I feel for them. But to the point that it's a culture. So it's not that every person has to be super oppressed, or every person has to feel disempowered every day because of the requirements of the religion. It may be the case that some are truly empowered, some feel that this uplifts them, and that it honors them as women. But the fact is that there is a wider culture that just has a push effect that creates, that fosters extremist situations like what these two ladies suffered. That it just doesn't. It's not just a random outlier that can happen anywhere and can happen to any communities. Communities foster that sort of thing. You know, it doesn't just come up randomly. So I think that the broader ideas behind modesty culture need to be addressed. So even if we're not talking about specifically the hijab, we can talk about what does it mean when a woman's worth is tied down to how sexual she is. What does it mean when, you know, the idea that a woman being covered or not covered is tied to how responsible she might be for sexual assault, right? I mean, these are concepts that are inherently backwards. They're concepts that are anti-woman. They shouldn't be concepts that we should be celebrating just under the guise of you know, diversity, because like these two so eloquently stated, it is something that affects Muslim communities, it affects Muslim women as well as ex-Muslims and people on the outside. But let me pose some questions to you guys about this. Generally speaking, how would you say that the religion as you experienced it was gendered? And I know you touched on this a little bit, that there are different impositions on men versus women. But what I'm interested in is what that does to the climate as a whole, specifically how that affects the way that the sexes interact with each other. Because I found that it creates this really toxic climate. It's with the way that men relate to women and women relate to men, because there's this idea that women are temptresses. so you relate, as men, you have to relate to them a little bit differently because they might lead you astray, and vice versa. So I think that it creates this situation where men and women inherently are going to mistrust each other to a certain degree, or to feel as if there should be a distance. So when we're talking about men and women understanding each other and moving forward to a more egalitarian society, step one has to be that we're willing to talk to each other. You know, we're willing to have these conversations. So I was just wondering about your perspectives on that issue.
So in my experience, and mainly because I came from a very segregated society in Saudi Arabia, it really does make a lot of women and a lot of men incapable of interacting with the opposite sex. They have no way of knowing what their intentions are. I mean, as an example, one of my friends, when she began working with me, and it was an unsegregated society, she thought that any man that was talking to her was hitting on her. And like, maybe he's not hitting on you, but you never know. I mean, maybe he was, because he himself grew up in a segregated society, and maybe she was one of the very few women that he gets to interact with on a daily basis. And it's not just that, it's also the concept of women are responsible because, you know, if you're not wearing modest clothing, if you're not wearing the hijab, if something happens to you, like you get sexually assaulted, or, you know, somebody catcalls you, or God forbid you get even raped, then it's your fault. It's one of the things that, you know, we hear here, especially in universities. And I remember when they do the orientation, they give you some of the talks. And one of the things that, you know, you hear is that sometimes when a woman goes to an officer, and I'm not trying to like put anybody under the spotlight or anything like that, but I mean, sometimes if you go to somebody and tell them, like, you know, you were raped or you were sexually assaulted, one of the first things that they do is they look at you. What are you wearing? And they ask you, what were you wearing? What were you doing? Who were you talking to? And I had that experience with somebody that I dated for a while. And I told him that, you know, a story that I read somewhere where a girl was out with her male friends and she was raped by all of them. was like, well, she should have known better. In modesty culture, in the cultures that we grew up in, if a girl goes out not wearing a hijab and she gets sexually assaulted, she's automatically blamed. Why was she out is number one. Why was she not wearing hijab? Or maybe her hijab was not worn the right way. And he thought, well, and that's not only that, especially in cultures in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, where they grow up thinking that men can do no wrong. We have a saying in Arabic, "Al-Rijal Shay al-Aiba." I don't know how to say that in English. It's like, there's no shame for men. Like, there's no way to know if a man was assaulted or if he strayed. Whereas a woman, it's, she's not a virgin, she's not a virgin. It's the same thing, it's that. So, men are pretty much blameless. And they also grow up with that notion. And so whenever they also, what's the word that I'm looking for? Make excuses for themselves, defend themselves even, saying, well, she was wearing a short skirt, or I could see her hair. I mean, she was asking for it. She was out, she looked at me, she smiled at me. No, she was not. And when you, and that's one of the things, if you grow up in a culture like that, when you teach your girls that, they're responsible for the way they dress and for what happens to them if they dress in a certain way. And you tell boys, you know what, you're blameless. You can do whatever you want, because the gendered norm in the way they raise these children is that they raise women to be pure, to be poised, to be pretty much clueless, and they have to be wrapped in, what is it?
Unequal.
Yes, thank you. Unequal to their male counterparts, where males, they can do whatever they want. Boys will be boys, this sort of thing. But it goes a notch up, more than that, in cultures that we grow up in.
So to piggyback off the whole purity culture / rape culture thing, there's this really interesting kind of like flip side that I see. It's kind of like two sides of the same coin. We talk a lot here in academia and third wave feminism, in liberal circles, about how a lot of the U.S. we call it a rape culture. That and by this we mean a lot of the things that you were just talking about. How women are scrutinized and judged and basically dressed up and down according to their conduct, just in order to and they're basically not able to defend themselves against the idea that they're not responsible for being assaulted and basically being oppressed. And just the very idea that, like, if you wear revealing clothing, then you're basically inviting objectification, and it's somehow your fault if someone decides to do something to you. So growing up, it was very, very similar to that. And the kind of like funny / ironic thing about it is that in the sect that I grew up in, and this is also generally a mainstream thing, and I'm kind of like giving this caveat because I know that there are other interpretations of hijab that don't hinge upon this this conception of sexual purity. I know that a lot of women choose to wear it as a marker of faith and not for these reasons and so on. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what's still predominant and what's still normative and what's still largely enforced, both socially and legally and extrajudiciously. So before I started wearing hijab, when my parents were teaching me about it and trying to get me to like it, because it wasn't just that they wanted me to wear hijab, they wanted me to love it. So they would give these analogies, these analogies that were basically at core objectifying, which is really ironic because so much of the rhetoric surrounding defense of the hijab as a good thing for women to engage in talks about how it allows you to stave off sexual objectification, how it allows you to be first and foremost viewed as a person, as an agent, and not as a sexual object for the consumption of others. Because you're covering everything, and so you're basically forcing the society to respect you and so on. The funny thing is that, my parents were teaching me that, a girl without her hijab is like a piece of candy with the wrapper off of it. And it's gonna get dirty and all the bugs are gonna crawl on it, and if someone's already put it in their mouth, then it becomes useless and worthless. Or is like a pearl without the shell around it, or something like that. Basically, literally comparing girls and women to objects, like actual objects, not just objects, but objects to be consumed. Instead of looking at us as people first and foremost, like our bodies were the most important thing about us. And so there was this idea that like, no, okay, so now you're getting to this age and you have to start covering up. And it does this thing where it not only desexualizes you like as an agent, like of course we weren't ever allowed to date, or let alone friends with people of the opposite sex, let alone like date or have any type of extramarital relationship. There are these like norms that they're both rooted in the jurisprudence and in the social stuff that have to do with like, no, you can't even shake hands with members of the opposite sex. You have to kind of like, just put your hand here. You never touch someone of the opposite sex. When you're talking to some members of the opposite sex, you have to look down and not actually look at them. It's called lowering your gaze. There's a saying that like, if a man and a woman are in a room by themselves, the devil is the third. So basically the idea that men and women cannot have any basic interactions that are not imbued with some kind of sexual dimension that has to, and that's the thing that you have to guard against. And so I felt desexualized as an agent, but also hypersexualized as an object. Because here I am, 8 years old, and I'm suddenly told that my hair, my arms, my limbs are sexual temptations, are fitna. The word fitna literally means sedition and discord, and that is a word that's used to describe women's bodies when they're uncovered. Or awra. Awra is the word that we use to describe the body parts that need to be covered up in terms of the modesty requirements. The awra areas are different for men and women, but awra, the Arabic word, comes from the word for disfigurement, like all of these negative stigma and the idea that like I, as a prepubescent child, I had to cover my hair and my arms and my legs so as not to tempt the boys and men around me. First of all, that is kind of, it's incredibly demeaning and dehumanizing, and it's the opposite of staving off objectification. It makes it so that if a bit of your hair or a sliver of your wrist or part of your ankle shows, then suddenly you're a slut. And suddenly you're inviting unsavory attention from the opposite sex, and it's your fault. And there's a reason that the countries with the most predominant norms in terms of women covering up have some of the highest sexual assault rates in the world. It's an absolute myth that covering your body actually staves off sexual objectification and assault. And so it was like I was depersonalized over and over again. And it had everything to do with just my gender and my body, and it basically affected every single interaction. There was no way I could interact with a member of the opposite sex that wasn't somehow already suspect. Like I couldn't call a friend over homework. I couldn't, just the very concept that you might want to sit down and have a conversation about just anything random, things that just people like to talk about. With no, every single time there's even suspicion you're talking to a boy. Who is he? What are you trying to do? Blah, 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 blah. And it's just the very idea that that there is nothing more important to your purpose as a woman than to guard your sexual purity. To the extent that like the thing I talked about where I tried to run away from home at 18, I was still wearing hijab when I left. I didn't like do anything, and I just wanted to leave because I frankly came from a violent, oppressive household and I couldn't freaking breathe. But when I came home, one of the first things my parents did was just endlessly interrogate me because they couldn't process the concept of me wanting to be on my own and have agency as a person in the world unless it had something to do with me being deviant, going astray. So my father's first two questions is, did you leave to become a prostitute or because you're pregnant? And then they took me to a gynecologist's office in Dahia, which is like the Hezbollah-controlled region of South Beirut, so that she could perform a virginity test on me, which is illegal, and which is a form of sexual assault. And ironic thing, he's so concerned about my sexual purity, they subject me to sexual assault. But it didn't matter because it was viewed as the only and the most important thing. That was the first thing they thought about, the first thing their minds went to, and the first thing they wanted to make sure. And after the gynecologist somehow confirmed that I was indeed a virgin, not that you can actually confirm that, the relief that my parents felt, it would be like you had told them I'd been cured of cancer or something. Like it was just like, they were just like, oh, thank Jesus. Not thank Jesus, but All right, I always talk too much, so.
Well, so let's see. I want to get to the Q&A. I always enjoy that aspect of it most in any of these talks. So I want to know what you guys think and what your questions might be. So just as a final question, I wanted to touch on a little bit about the relationship between Western feminism and Islam and women's rights, because I think a lot of people have noticed that there is a little bit of silence coming from modern day feminists when it comes to the hijab, when it comes to misogyny, when it comes from Islamic sources. And there seems to be a double standard, and a lot of people have noticed it. And especially far-right people have noticed it, and they've capitalized on it, and they've used it as a way to say, see, these feminists, they aren't truly feminist all along. They don't really care about women's rights, because if they did, then they would care about the women's rights of Muslim women. So unfortunately, it's become this really toxic atmosphere, and I wanted to know about your thoughts, where you think Western feminism has failed and how you think it can improve, briefly if possible, because I do want to get to the Q&A.
Quick question, Western feminism as opposed to what kind of feminism?
Well, I would say feminism as practiced in the West. I don't mean feminism as the ideal, which is to say that women's rights are human rights, women deserve equality. Not the ideal, but as it is practiced by women in the West.
Let's just say third wave / intersectional feminism. I think that's a good
okay.
encapsulation.
Okay. For me, and I grew up in I was very lucky that my father really believed in women's education and women's right to work and the like, and mainly because he didn't trust men back home, and he thought that all men were not to be trusted, and he wanted me to be set for life. So he pushed the education, and he pushed me to always be successful at work. And even though, and I did not mention this before, but I escaped Saudi Arabia. I left in the middle of the night one day and just got on a plane and came here. I did get a lot of threats from my family. My father was not very happy, but he was never unhappy because I was an atheist. He was unhappy that I was uncovered, and he thought people were using me, and nobody was using me, Dad. But back to your question about feminism. So my father was the first person that I met who I would call a feminist. Maybe not today, but back then, when he was pushing me towards, he would always give me books to learn, and he never treated me differently than he did my brothers. For example, if I cried, he would yell at me and tell me, you're a grown woman, you're not supposed to cry. And he would say the same thing to my brothers, but you're grown men, you're not supposed to cry. He treated me the same way he treated them. So that's how I viewed feminism as I was growing up, that it's equality between the two sexes at any point, including, working. And when in Saudi Arabia, you need a legal guardian to go to school, to work, to pretty much do anything. And my father would always scoff and laugh at that because he thought it was ridiculous. And he thought that this is one of the things that women should always be fighting for. And he was very glad that feminism still existed in Saudi Arabia for that reason. And I've always thought that this is what modern day or Western feminism was like, until I came to the United States a few years ago when I escaped. And I realized that feminism was botched, or somebody stole it and turned it into this hate group of some sort, in which it's either anti-men or anti-certain types of men, and it's become very toxic. And that's not the feminism that I look at. I look at feminism, as Hiba mentioned, it intersectional feminism, the feminism of the 60s and the 70s that introduced women, that got women out and about, like the sexual revolution, women going into the workplace, women demanding equal pay, demanding equal rights, demanding equal presence. And it's funny that now that this is what we're trying to do, we're trying to demand equal opportunities as ex-Muslims. And yet these feminists look at us as hateful people that want to destroy Islam and destroy Muslim people, especially Muslim women. I don't want to destroy Muslim women, and I'm pretty sure none of us do. I mean, Hiba has family that is hijabi. I have family that are hijabi. I don't want to go and take off their hijab. I want them to make that choice on their own. If they want to wear it, then by all means, this is how you show your faith. But I don't want to wear it, and I don't want you to force me to wear it. I don't want you to tell me that I have to wear it, and I don't want you to look at me differently because I don't wear it. Why can't I be respected the same way you are respected? By looking at yourself like you're better than me because you wear the hijab, then that means that I'm lacking something. And another thing that bothers me about this, that modern day feminism are always against this purity culture, and they always talk about rape culture. And yet they, at the same time, promote hijab and promote hijabi women that talk, and I'm not talking about all hijabi women, I'm talking specifically about the women that always talk about, this is how I dress and I love modesty. It's like, but isn't modesty the complete opposite of what you're trying to eliminate or trying to fight?
This is an involved question. I'll try not to. Okay, so I think I differ on certain aspects. For one, I think that there is a lot that is going on that is very, very good when it comes to the way that feminism is refined and practiced today. I also think that in its very attempts to be more progressive, it ends up falling into some very terrible and dangerous flaws. So when we've been, there's this kind of like recently, the past like 15, 20 years or so, this kind of revival of the concept of feminism is not just having to do with certain standards of equality, like whether or not women can work or be single mothers or blah, 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 but the idea that, like, look, women come from very, very varied groups, and a lot of the time their oppression hinges on things that have to do with more than their status as women. We want to talk about how being queer intersects with being a woman, or how being of color intersects with being a woman, or how being disabled or economically underprivileged, or so on. The idea that the way in which women are empowered in the world definitely hinges upon the intersections of certain identities. So there's all these focuses on their identities. And yeah, it's true that in many, many ways, a woman from a Muslim background has it harder here in the US or in the West or whatever than a white woman. And it's really hard to parse the distinctions and so on. And so there's that. There's the kind of like this tendency to want to move away from a unilateral idea of what women want and need, which is good. But then that falls into what we call choice feminism. The idea that feminism is about uplifting the individual choices of women rather than tearing down the institutions that restrict and constrain women from having certain choices. There's the idea that there has been so much focus on frankly privileged women, white women, middle class women, blah, 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 and their empowerment, and now we have to move on. And we have to start listening to minorities, and we have to start seeing the ways in which they're impacted in various contexts, and we need to involve our activism in that way, the kind of like soundbite that like my feminism is going to be intersectional or it's going to be bullshit. And in an attempt to do that, there's this very conscious anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist sensibility that's coming out. That like, look, we know that anti-Muslim bigotry is a very real and oppressive force in this world. We also know that we Westerners have had this tradition of imposing our views and our way of life on people, especially people from the third world, especially immigrants and so on, and we need to step back and we need to start listening to the women from these backgrounds and taking into consideration what they have to say. And we can't just sit there and impose things on them. The problem is, and there's the concept of positionality, that you have to be conscious of your position, of how you might have blind spots due to your privilege, due to the way you're situated, where you just don't have access to the same information and experience as other people. You have to step back and you have to give the platform to other people. I think that's largely what's behind what goes on, where you end up having, ironically, the most privileged and voiced women who end up endorsing conservative values and a certain way of life as their choice being upheld by leftists, by liberals, by feminists, to the exclusion of any competing narrative. And here and there, and I think this has to do with issues that go into the theoretical failings of models like positionality and intersectionality to begin with. So the idea of positionality, you're like, well, clearly, so a very conscientious, progressive, white feminist woman might be like, I am not in a position to pass judgment on how Muslim women live their lives and how they want to conduct themselves and their families and their communities and so on. I need to step back and listen, because their positionality is just basically has priority over mine in this issue. The problem with that is that you just keep picking apart when it comes to positionality, because you're never going to be able to tell if the person you're talking to is an adequate representative of the community that they say that they are representative. It's an attempt to homogenize in the very process of diversifying and differentiating. And then who ends up getting kind of like their issues getting smoothed over and thrown under the rug and denied and blah, blah, blah. Like there was that example of, I forgot what UK university, there was a feminist/LGBT group that was hosting an event, and someone asked them to condemn FGM, female genital mutilation, and they kind of gave a pause and they're like, well, I can't condemn female genital mutilation because my colonials passed. The idea that because of your position, you are unable to apply the same standards of critique, that should be objective, even if you don't have access to the full information, and so on. And the funny thing is that so much of the apologism that comes out of the mouths of the people who are given platforms by intersectional feminists today follows the same exact structure as the apologism of conservative Christians or insular communities with different types of purity culture that have this, that fall into the same exact fallacies that are considered unacceptable, that are considered toxic and insidious and oppressive by the same people who kind of like aren't able to provide the same standards of critique. So to give an example, the FGM example, there was an article by an anthropologist, I think it was in the Atlantic a few years ago, about how she went to a certain village in Africa and spent time with some of the women there, and how they were like furiously defending the fact that they underwent genital cutting before their weddings, and they had and she came away like blown away by the idea that like, oh, this practice has cultural significance and personal meaning, and they cleave to it strongly. Well, you could say that about almost any toxic and oppressive norm in the West that feminists tend to speak about. You can say that about like, beauty norms or whatever. Like the way that women are expected to, the heels and the makeup and blah, 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 and their worth is reduced to their appearance. You can have a woman who the idea that women are the ones that socialize each other into it, the idea that there are lots of women who like and cleave to and strongly defend their choices when it comes to that, and the idea that these still pose oppressive institutions that need to be dismantled when it comes to just how women are able to conduct and comport themselves in their lives. If they deviate from those standards, all of those points are consistent. But somehow the same standards of critique aren't applied. People will go like, well, the women say they want it, and it's the women that socialize other women into it. It's not that like it's men forcing them into doing it. It's like a sisterhood thing. And it's just like, you are so concerned with not overstepping that you are overstepping, because you end up elevating and celebrating the voices that obscure and what's the word? Kind of marginalize the most silenced, invisible, and oppressed people from within Muslim communities or ex-community of color or whatever.
Okay, well, I think that that should be the last word on it. But I don't know how we want to go about doing the question and answer session. Do people have questions or is that okay? Yeah. Well, we only have one working mic. So
we can hear people's voices, so just they'll shout them out, and please repeat the question into the microphone.
okay, that makes sense. Very reasonable.
The guy in the middle was the first person right there. That guy.
Okay, sure.
So you talked a lot about how Islam sees men and women a little differently. So I was wondering if there's a gender disparity in terms of people joining ex-Muslims, if it's more women or men, or if it's fairly balanced.
Oh yeah, sure, I can answer that. So the gentleman was wondering if there was a gender disparity with people joining ex-Muslim North America. I'm assuming you're specifically referring to our organization. A little bit, but it's something like 60-40. Last I checked. So it exists, but it's not as severe as I would have thought. And I have also found that women, well, ex-Muslim women in particular, are more outspoken. They're loud, and there's a sense of like outrage, and because they often have. It's more difficult for ex-Muslim women to remain in the closet and live their lives the way that they want. I've found that they're more likely to be open. They're more likely to say, I'm an ex-Muslim, and then just suffer the consequences as it comes, because as a Muslim man, you might have a little bit more freedoms. You can marry outside of the religion, for example, if you're a man. So there's certain freedoms that men have. So some ex-Muslim men say, well, I can just pretend and live this life, and it's acceptable. And I think with women, that's just an easier choice to make in some ways, because women can just say, well, I can't put up with this life at all. So you're sort of forced into just being open and leaving behind those communities. But that was a good question. Thank you. Yes, sorry.
I'm interested about your relationship with your families today, because you did say that you left in the middle of the night, and you said that you had like a very aggressive family, and I wonder if they know if you're atheist today and how they perceive that.
Can I answer that? So, as I said, my family are very devout, and it's one of the things that Hiba also touched on. It's a sense of community. Like, the whole family has to look the same. The whole family has to look pretty much similar, like copy-paste from each other. If anybody is different, then they're either oppressed or, like what they did with me, disowned, publicly disowned. So when I left in the middle of the night, and then my parents hacked into my email, found out that I was an atheist, downloaded a lot of pictures from my Google account, and saved them as evidence of my straying or dissent or whatever you want to call it. Then they trusted the wrong types of people who told other people, and then everybody found out that I was an atheist. I got a lot of threats. They publicly disowned me. My mother still does not talk to me. If anything, my mother has said the worst things anyone has ever said to me from the people that I have that have tried to contact me. My father is more, just wants to make sure that I'm alive, that I don't need anything kind of guy. I have 3 siblings. My brothers still talk to me. They don't really care much about religion, but they're not atheists. Other than that, because my family really cares about their public image, they try their best to make sure that no one tries to contact me. And this has happened when a cousin of mine that I am friends with contacted me and we became friends. But a picture of us started circling around in the community. And he got into a lot of trouble, and we had to come up with this elaborate lie in which I apologized profusely to him for trying to lead him astray and him like mouthing off at me or something like that, so he can show his parents that, look, I have nothing to do with her anymore. And recently, a younger cousin of mine, 17 years old, is pretty much risking his freedom trying to contact me because he's going through now what I went through when I was his age. So just to give a short answer, I don't have a relationship with my family other than my 2 youngest brothers and a few cousins that try their best to hide it from the family.
It's kind of mixed for me. It's been 5 years since I left. I left in a way such that well, the only way I could leave was that if I knew that I would be okay if I was cut off from everything. So I came to the U.S. Graduate program, and I had a teaching position, etc. I was financially independent, and I didn't tell my parents that I was an apostate and I was coming to the U.S. because I could live there in a way that I couldn't back home, and so it kind of came as a huge shock to them. And at first I tried to hide it. I was like, you know what, I'm here. They're all the way across the world in Lebanon. I can just do what I want here, and I don't need to kind of like fuss about it, and it's just easier it wasn't easier because they were still, my father also hacked into my email, telecom engineer. And it was just the kind of thing where like my mother made sure I had a landline at home, would call me every night to make sure I wasn't off gallivanting anywhere. It was the type of thing where they were like, it was just obsessive, the policing and the control, even though they had much smaller ability to do it from across the country, across the world. It was still so suffocating. Like every single time I wanted to go to a restaurant that wasn't halal, or heaven forbid a bar or whatever, I would withdraw cash because my father kind of like looked at all my bank statements and saw he had access to my account. Just things like that. And after a few months, and I also have family in the Arab American immigrant community up in Dearborn, Michigan, as my grandparents were Civil War refugees. And the idea was that I would be expected to go there and spend the whole time with my family during breaks. And so Christmas break was coming around from my first year in the US, and I was just like, I cannot do it. I cannot put my hijab back on and go up and pretend to be a good Muslim girl every moment of every day I can't do it. So I came out to my mom. And I told her, and she was heartbroken, blah, blah, blah. My father disowned me completely, it's mutual. His entire side of the family, none of them speak to me, which is good, horrible people. My mom, over the years, we've slowly begun to be able to have a relationship again, but mostly hinges on us never talking about the things that we disagree about. And just kind of like, you don't ask, don't tell, just... And that's kind of it. I'm not really part of the family anymore. It's phone calls here and there. Sometimes I go up and visit my family when my mom visits her folks up in Michigan. For a couple of days at the time, during the entire time, I'm just trying to keep the peace. And so I just don't say anything. I don't talk about my beliefs. I dress as conservatively as possible without putting a scarf on my head because I'm not willing to make that concession. And that's it. And I wish it didn't have to be the case. I wish I could go to weddings and be part of everything, but I can't. And that's just how it is. And
can I suggest something, please? Would you have one person address the questions this way? There will be a reduction in the amount of time per question. Sure. And because there are so many questions and the time's gonna fly fast.
The time's gonna fly no matter what. We could, even if we did this as quick as possible.
Question afterwards, at the end, they can go to each person and ask some questions after that.
Sure. I think that's a good suggestion.
Yes.
First and foremost, I really would like to applaud your courage and the stance that you took for what you believe in. Thank you for doing this, and I am happy that you guys are here in the United States. We stand for freedom of speech and freedom of religion, so thank you. So, I have 100 questions, but I'm going to narrow it to 2. For Hiba, Saudi Arabia just recently allowed women in Saudi Arabia to, or I'm sorry, Ghada. Okay. In Saudi Arabia, they allowed females to drive for the first time in history starting June 2018. So I would like to ask your opinion about that. The second question is, in January of this year, we saw a lot of women march and protest all over the country, wearing vaginas that resembled, or wearing costumes that resembled vaginas, demanding respect. So, but one of the people who orchestrated and organized this, her name was Linda Sarsour.
Yeah, I want to talk about this.
Okay, I will let her talk about Linda.
So Linda Sarsour is one of the females that I am very would like to get your opinion about how you guys feel about her, if you guys tried to counter what she is doing and what she's saying.
Okay, to answer your first question about women driving in Saudi Arabia, it's certainly a step forward. It's a step in the right direction. And there was an article that was released right after, I think it was in The Atlantic, and the article said that when the decree was issued, phone calls were, there were phone calls to the female activists, the women activists that worked very, very hard specifically for women driving in Saudi Arabia, and they were told not to talk about it at all. Nothing negative, nothing, only praise to the prince for this royal decree. So it is both a positive and a negative, and a positive because, you know, more rights for women is always a great thing, and the negative because it's not attributed to the women that fought, and some of them were back in the 90s were even imprisoned and were called horrible names, and they were, you know, put in the newspaper as well as, you know, these nasty women, and nasty was not one of the words that were used, it was way worse than that. So in a way, I'm happy, and now I'm just hoping that next is the royal guardian system going down. And now.
So that's a big question, feelings about Linda Sarsour. I mean, I feel like I could go on about that for some time. But just to point out just a few things that I found most disturbing about her inclusion in the Women's March. If some of you might have noticed that Women's March was actually started by this white woman, and then they pulled in other leaders who they felt like represented different communities, and the other leaders, or there was a woman from a Latin background, a black woman, and then a Muslim. And I think this illustrates very clearly the racialization of Muslims and this consideration of Islam. So there's this whole idea that well, you know, Islam is not a race, and that's the first thing that anybody really talks about. But it's true that Islam is treated as a race, increasingly treated as a race, which is why we really need to counter this idea. There was not a lot of thought put into why she belonged on that stage, other than the idea that, well, she is a Muslim woman, and Muslim women are you know, facing hostility in this atmosphere with especially after the election of Donald Trump. So I really felt like it was a political symbol, and not one that was thoughtful in what it actually meant and what it actually symbolized. And this sort of encapsulates my feelings with this feminism that we see, the way that it's practiced. It's like this bubblegum feminism. It's not really a feminism that is thoughtful, and not a feminism that is centered truly on women's rights. I mean, and as Hiba mentioned multiple times, that there really is a performative aspect to it, and it really takes guts to be able to say, well, there are women that are all around the world that are facing some severe sexism, and it is sexism that is worse than the sexism that we experience here. And we need to talk about it, and we need to be open about it, and we need to have these conversations while keeping the idea in mind that Muslims as a people also deserve compassion. So I was just incredibly disheartened by the inclusion of Linda Sarsour, and I won't be surprised if she continues her trajectory as being a progressive leader, I'm sure that she's going to run for political office or of some sort. And unfortunately, I think that's a representative of how progressivism as a whole is just sort of not too tied down to the principles that it should be tied down to. Okay, there's a lot of people, but I saw you raise your hand.
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for your presentation. I came from Muslim background too, and I totally agree with you that the women right in the Middle East and the Islamic Arabic world have a lot of space for improvement. But it seems to me that we should look at the issue at a larger angle. The lack of democracy, at least in the Middle East, the Arab Middle East, and the corrupted government throughout the Arab world has a lot to do with how they treat their people. Like, for instance, there is in other words, the oppression of people, it includes men and women in the Middle East. I mean, look at from Morocco to Kuwait. There is no one Arab country that can say we are a democratic country. So we should put this in the picture when we talk about it. I mean, the issue of women, it's not only the women who are oppressed, the men too.
Can I take this one?
Sure.
To clarify, just because we're focusing this panel on the aspect of women, only one, we can only touch upon so many things that influence this type of oppression. That doesn't mean that we're saying it's the only type of oppression and that these are the only factors that need to be addressed. Definitely everything that you mentioned in terms of corruption and people like to talk about imperialism and there are lots of things contributing to large-scale inequalities across the Middle East and across the Muslim majority world in general. And we can only address those things by addressing all of their particularities. And there's only so much that we can cover in a panel like this. So.
But don't you think that the different culture within the Islamic world has a lot to do with the lack of understanding about what Islam is? Of course, I appreciate your experiences.
I think that's reductive.
Do you think that your experiences can be applicable to the large Muslim community at large?
Yes, I think we're talking about mainstream trends. I think we're talking about dominant structures that need to be dismantled. Of course, it's not something that can be applied to every single person or every single community. I mean, the Muslim majority world is vast. Tons of diversity and differentiation there, and that doesn't discount the fact that these are essential problems, and women's empowerment is crucial to the progress of any society and the progress of democratic values to begin with. It's not that this is kind of like a cart before the horse issue the way that you're presenting it. We can't establish the egalitarian political structures unless we look at what's at root behind them, our social norms and institutions. And I think we need to move on to another question.
Well, I can actually, I'm going to add one more thing to that. We won't see democracy flourishing in the Muslim world. We won't see women's rights flourishing in the Muslim world until the idea that the religion is a sole way that we can know the truth about the world is completely, destroyed. When it comes to women's rights in particular, the first people who will stand up against women's rights in the Muslim world are religious groups and organizations. In Pakistan, there was a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, there was finally a law passed against domestic violence
Okay, a law that finally said that domestic violence is bad, it's illegal, you know. So this law came into the picture, and the people that were standing up against it, the people that mobilized against it, were religious groups and organizations. There was 35 religious groups and organizations that were standing up to say, no, this shouldn't be allowed, because Islamically, a husband has a right to discipline his wife. So if we're talking about democracy, is just another way where there are many Muslims who believe that democracy is not Islamic. So long as we're having this conversation and everything is centered on what is or isn't Islamic, you're not going to have progress. So the conversation needs to be that it doesn't matter whether something is or isn't Islamic. What it matters is it progressive? Is it good for humanity? Is it centered on human rights? We need to just move past the idea that we can be rooted down to this religion in any way. Otherwise, you're right, we won't have democracy, we won't have women's rights, we won't have any of it.
Can I give just a bit? Just to add on to that, the kind of like the Lebanon parallel to that, domestic violence was only very recently criminalized in Lebanon. I think it was 13 or 14. And it was kind of like a long judicial battle, because a lot of draft laws were proposed time and time again that were shot down. They were generally shot down by the two most prominent religious organizations in the country. And we're talking about the religious institutions, the religious elite, the people that like dictate what the norms and standards are. So Dar al-Fatwa, which is the highest Sunni authority in the country, Majlis al-Shia al-A'la, which is the highest Shia authority in the country. Every single time a draft law was proposed, they both came out and said, this threatens the closeness of familial bonds, and basically domestic violence, beating your wife, was not actually even illegal, let alone just all the structures you need to enforce that type of stuff, until very, very recently. And it was largely because of religious opposition. It was largely because of patriarchal, conservative religious opposition.
The ladies at the back.
Yeah.
So I have a comment and a question, where it's more like, in my opinion, a lot of those problems we have in our Middle Eastern communities, culture and religious way, basically we were taught from a young age that people around us love us for a reason. Like, they don't have that unconditional love for us. For example, if I do something, I might hurt my parents. If I am homosexual, oh my God, that's my life, but I'm hurting my parents. There is no such a thing as unconditional love in their terms. My friends, if I become an atheist, they would not like me. They don't want to hang out with me. They don't want to know me. I'm ashamed for them. It's not like, I support you, you're my friend, you're my kid, whatever you have, whatever you decide, your life, I support you. If you're wrong and you want to come back and you want a shoulder to cry on, I support you. We don't have that mentality in the Middle East. We have more of the mentality is, this is how people are gonna look at us, and this is how you're gonna carry yourself to keep us from people talking badly about us, regardless of what is it, regardless if you're happy or not. And now I heard both of your stories, and I'm sure it wasn't an easy decision to leave families back home and decide to start a new life. But my question is, what was going through your mind? What was the process that made you like, you know what, that's it, I have to choose either me or the people I love?
I completely agree with you with how our culture is. It's very conditional. I can only love you if you follow a certain path. And that is unfortunately the way my mother has been raised, and that's how she also shows her conditional love to me. Her love to me is conditional on me being, hijabi, wearing modest clothing, and practicing Islam the way she wants me to practice it under her eye. And going back to your question is what was going through my mind. So after becoming an atheist, and that was way back in 2011, I had just graduated from college and went back to Saudi Arabia to work and I lived under my family's rule. I had to wear a hijab, of course, because it was Saudi Arabia. And I didn't really have as much freedom as even my friends back then. Like, even going out to see my friends was a hassle, because I had to tell them where I was going, who I was going with, how long I was going to be out, and what I was going to be there. And of course, my phone had to be with me at all times in case one of them calls, and if they do call, I had to be in complete quiet, just in case, they hear something that they didn't like, and then I have to come up with a way to explain it. I was living pretty much a double life, and even though, and as one of the things that I have been asked, like, don't you think what you're doing hurts your parents? Why don't you just, why were you lying this whole time? You think I liked lying? It killed me. It absolutely destroyed me. It made me depressed, and I had to. Yeah, I didn't have any option. I really believed that if my family knew anything about me, that I would probably give my dad a heart attack and he would die. And because, and it really was not easy, but one of the thing that really did change was I sought help. I went to a psychiatrist and I had a therapist, and the more I went to them, the more I went through the treatment, and it wasn't drugs that got me to go out. It was a book that I read, and I still can't remember the book's name, but I remember that it was about getting out of the victim mentality. And one of the things in the book that really stood out to me was a chapter about relationships with your family. There's only so much you can do with your family. You can't change them, but you can change how you react to them. And the way that they react is not your fault, and you're not to blame for it. You did not cause your parents to be angry or sad. Whereas the way we grew up, it's when your parents are sad or you're angry, it's because of you, because something you did. It's because of because the whole, conditional love thing. And once that got out of my head, that, now I'm free. I can do whatever I want. And Saudi Arabia is not the only country in the world. The earth is vast. I can be in anywhere, in any place. But the one thing that got me to go and book my ticket and leave was when my dad was really angry with me trying to push the limits, and told me, I can go to your workplace and tell them that I don't want you to work anymore, and then you get to stay here under my eye and I can watch you 24 hours a day. And that scared me. And so I booked my flight and got out.
Can you just wait?
I'm just asking to look this side.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
We're ignoring you guys. Okay, we'll turn over. I'll just add one more thing to that. When the most toxic thing about an honor culture is that it encourages narcissistic behavior in family members. It encourages mothers and fathers to look at their children's actions and say, well, if they misbehave, if they're deviant, it will reflect on me, and the community will treat me horribly too. So it encourages this kind of mentality where you police each other. Mothers police their daughters, and what's not understood is that mothers often have a very active role in enforcing, modesty norms among their daughters to make sure that they live a good life, but also that the community doesn't come back and harm them in any way. And my parents, who are somewhat accepting of me, have faced, now what's happening is that I'm not facing any kind of serious issues with my parents, but they're facing it from their community. They're being ostracized from their community. They're being harassed from cousins that I've never seen in my life, calling them and harassing them and telling them what are they doing and how could they do this. So there's this effect, and it's very potent precisely because it's a network effect. It's not just one individual doing something, it's one individual and what this means for everyone around you.
Yeah, I think a lot of it boils down to that mainstream Muslim communities tend to be a lot more collectivist versus how individualistic the US and the West in general is. And the thing is when I understand that the way my mother was controlling me my whole life, I couldn't buy a piece of clothing without her signing off on it. She had to know every single moment of every day what I was doing and with who. I know it's because she was terrified. She wanted me to have a good life because in her world, a girl who is viewed as stepping out of the bounds of modesty is a girl who doesn't have a future, is a girl who is ruined, is a girl who isn't going to find a husband, isn't going to have a life, isn't going to have a family, isn't going to have acceptance and safety and prosperity. I know that she was basically essentially micromanaging every aspect of my existence because she wanted me to be prosperous and safe. And the idea that you could be prosperous and safe even if you were a you know, a sinner, and I'm as big a sinner as they come. I'm a bisexual, polyamorous atheist. I mean, and it's at some point it gets to the point where, like, is my entire family and what they think more important than my basic self-determination? Because I had conflict about this. We all have conflict about this. For the reason why it took me a while to come out to my family, it wasn't just that I was like nervous or anxious or afraid. It was also like, well, my mom's gonna take a lot of crap for this back home. And how is this going to affect my sister's prospects? I have a little sister. And at some point, it was whether or not I could continue to survive the way that I was living. And I just couldn't. My survival was on the line. I knew that if I didn't leave Lebanon when I did, and I'd been trying for years, believe me, I don't think I would have lived another year. That's how miserable it was. I just couldn't exist that way anymore.
Sure.
There is a saying between religious communities and all religions that we should not judge the religion by its bad followers. So I was just wondering if the oppression that you were talking about, guys, is in true Islam or its bad followers. This is my first question. The second one is that you said, guys, that you established ex-Muslims because you needed a community and people were suffering and they need jihad. May I ask why they need jihad? What are the consequences, the risks involved if they came out? I heard about a war happened after Muhammad died. It's called Hurub al-Ridda, and people were killed just because they left Islam after Muhammad died. So is that the punishment of leaving Islam, or is just bad people doing that?
Do you want to take the second question? I'll take the first one.
Sure.
All right. Remind me of the first question again? Sorry, it was in my head. It was in my head.
We should not judge religion.
Real Islam. All right. Real Islam. I love this topic. Real Islam is a red herring, right? There is a vast amount of diversity in the Muslim world. There is no agreement from one sect to another what set of principles and edicts and values constitute the core of the faith, even like setting the most minute details aside, constitute the core of the faith versus not. Like, okay, the sect of Islam that I grew up in, it was absolutely uncontroversial to the extent that like it was almost viewed as
But what about
but,
the main Islam,
listen. It was basically viewed almost unthinkable, the idea that like hijab isn't mandatory. And then you have some people of some schools of thought that go like, no, the Quran never said that a woman needs to wear hijab in this way or whatever. And then you have other interpretations that say otherwise. You have people who are able to say, no, it's perfectly possible to reconcile Islam in these ways. And the people who practice it, like you know, Ghada's parents, they thought the Salafis and the Wahhabis were wrong. The Shia think the Sunnis are wrong. The Sunnis think the Shia are wrong. Most Muslims think Ahmadis aren't Muslims, and Ahmadis think that they're Muslims. It's just that there is no consensus on what the true abstract Platonic form of Islam is. And to continuously move the goalposts and say, well, these are just misinterpretations, or these are just bad faith actors, or these are just flawed people. My mother used to always love to say, it's Islam is perfect, Muslims are imperfect. But there is no one Islam that you can look at that you can point to that and say that is representative of what Islam is, and without excluding and marginalizing some type of Muslim. And so I feel like we are less concerned with what a kind of like Platonic form of the true real Islam is, especially because we're not Muslims. Like that's a theological question. That's a question that's between every particular Muslim and their belief system and their God, what they think is the true path. As far as we're concerned, in a socio-political context, Islam is the conglomeration of Muslim practice and belief. That's what it is. And that is what we need to address. And Muslim practice and belief does have overarching institutions and norms and values. And you can point to the particular, and it's going to differ. Like some Muslim societies have a problem with FGM, some of them don't. Some have a problem with girls not being able to be educated, some of them don't. Our families had never had a problem with women being educated. That was not a thing. But the thing is, you just keep, if you are just focusing on whether or not this practice or belief is really Islam, then you're basically missing the point. It doesn't matter whether it's really Islam. It matters that it is there, that it is normalized, that it is propagated, and that it basically is enacted in these ways that have real-world consequences, and that's what we're concerned with.
I actually don't. I mean, I don't have a lot to add to that. I think that she covered I think she covered that second question in that. A lot of apologism goes to, they'll point at this one verse they'll be like, oh, but this one verse that says, accept all people, whatever, and this means that this harmful practice is not actually Islamic, that it's not rooted in the religion at all. This is such a common trope that I'm actually I'm just going to address it very generally, in that to say what Hiba said about what true Islam is also the definition that I think that should be considered. So long as the vast majority of Muslims consider apostasy to be a criminal matter, so long as many of them consider us as people that should be punished in one way or another. I mean, there's so many governments, Muslim majority governments around the world that do punish apostasy or even blasphemy of any kind. Some of them actively go to persecute blasphemy. Pakistan, for example, is expanding this and is they're spreading this to Facebook, where they're going into Facebook posts and finding, oh, this one guy, he blasphemed. Now we're going to arrest him, and he'll be faced with the punishment for that. So to the extent that can you find a contradiction to certain things in Islam? Yes, you can. It's a very contradictory text. It's actually, this is why it's man-made. There are quite a bit of it that doesn't make a lot of sense. And you're going to be able to find justification for a lot of things. But the problem is that religious fundamentalists will always have all the justification that they need. They will always be able to say, when it comes to women's rights, that the Quran gives the man the authority to discipline his wife. And they will always be able to point to that verse and say, it says clearly that a man has this right.
Or to point to a hadith or a fatwa.
They will always have some sort of justification, and they will then enact godly justification behind what is really kind of a twisted personal desire. So I think we need to keep that in mind, and I think we need to consider that. And this is why the data of what Muslims actually think and how they interpret their religion, vast majorities of them around the world, matters. Sure. Yeah. I think. Well, you've had a few. So.
I'm sorry.
The guy in the back. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much for coming today. From Denver chapter, and thank you, Mohammed, for coming. I have a question. Actually, I have an opinion about it, and I'm very strong about this opinion, but I want to hear your opinion, guys, and whoever can answer this. What do you think, in a few words, about the use of the hijab in the movement to resist? You must have seen that picture on social media.
Yeah.
The American woman wearing the American flag as the hijab. What do you think of that? I think it's contributing to the oppression of women in the Middle East.
Well, so I think we discussed some of this already with the Linda Sarsour question, in that we have to be careful about what symbols we use and why we use them, and it can't just be, well, we mean it to stand for the dissent against religious persecution of minorities. We have to be more thoughtful about these kinds of things. I'm sorry, but I feel like we covered that already a little bit. Sure.
I have a quick question. I don't know if you covered this because I came a little bit late, but how do you balance, outside of academia and outside of maybe these kinds of circles, how do you balance critiquing Islam while not feeding into, because I come from a Muslim family, I just don't want them to go through any discrimination. I don't want to feed into any bigotry. So how do you balance that yourself?
That's a big question, and well,
difficult
question, and that's definitely something that I've seen time and time again as a reason why ex-Muslim activists choose not to talk, because they say, well, I don't want to make things worse for the people that I love, And in order to not make that atmosphere worse, I will choose to not talk about it now. But my opinion has always been that if it's not us, the people who are compassionate and who can look at Muslims and say, I stand for their rights to practice their religion, that I stand for their rights as citizens in the United States, that I stand against demonizing them as people. If it's not people like us who are standing up and talking about this issue, then it will be the people who hold all those nasty views. It will be, this issue will just be ceded, this ground will just be ceded to the worst elements of society who absolutely don't care about the well-being of Muslims. So I think somebody needs to stand up, and it should be us.
Just
Sure.
To add on to that, this is really hard because we face an issue with the stuff that we talk about is very, very easy to be co-opted and twisted, especially by, let's be frank, the right wing, who try to talk, who kind of use things like oppression of Muslim women or whatever, and they're really, really, what's the word? Hypocritical about it because they endorse many of the same conservative values and so on. And they basically use it. They're just using they're using us in order to further their own bigotry, their hatred and narrative. And so we have to resist being co-opted on that side, and at the same time, we have to continually speak out against anti-Muslim bigotry because of this environment, and at the same time, we have to also somehow reconcile that with the fact that, racism is a force to be contended with when it comes to the problems facing Muslim communities. So is honor violence. So, so are all these various forms of oppression and bigotry against queer people, against, it's so hard to be trans in a Muslim society, we call ourselves ex-Muslims for a reason because there is so much stigma surrounding the very idea that you could possibly leave the faith. Apostasy itself is as stigmatized as
murder.
Sometimes, yeah, and we can't forego one of these causes for the other. For fear of enabling anti-Muslim bigotry, we can't suddenly start being silent about all of these other problems because those are problems that need to be addressed too, and we would be enabling those problems with our silence. And I am of the opinion that the other problems plaguing Muslim communities are far more grave in their actual material effects in terms of how they impact people's lives than, even just the violence than anti-Muslim bigotry is. And we have to find a way to talk about all of that without our narrative being co-opted by the right and without also, falling into bigotries ourselves. It involves tremendous amount of nuance and parsing and quibbling and people policing our language, and we have to end up fulfilling the expectations of people completely outside of the scope of everything that's going on because they have standards for how we should be talking about feminism and things like that. And so yeah, we do it with great difficulty, and it's a very uphill battle. We find almost no mainstream liberal venues that will listen to us long enough to realize that we are not who they think we are, and that type of thing. So
I think Sean, how much time do we have? Not much, right?
Yeah, we should be wrapping up.
We should be wrapping up. Yeah. So there's a lot of good questions, but yeah, it's about 8. It's about 8. Yeah, we can get your question. Sure. Yeah.
I first of all commend you for your bravery and everything. I am from Libya. I'm an Arab and I'm Muslim. I don't call myself a devout Muslim. I'm a practicing Muslim. I believe in the ideals of Islam as well as Judaism, Christianity, as well as the good ideas of the agnostics and
atheists.
The point here is, I would like to ask you and also invite you, if the answer is no to my question, invite you to look at the Islamic world outside of Saudi Arabia and outside of the region of Lebanon you, Hiba, is talking about. I lived in Lebanon 6 months. If you have a comment, please say it out loud.
Okay. I have looked at Islam outside of the realm.
Let me just finish. Feminism that you talk about. I am 69 years old. I can remember as back as 1955. We had the best, perfect example of feminism in Libya, and controlled and directed. Women ran their own activities, supported by men officially from the government institutes and from men on the individual level. Pakistan.
What about now?
I'm sorry?
What about the women now in 2017?
Now it's the
Doesn't
opposite.
exist
You know why?
because it's controlled by.
I'll tell you why. I tell you why not. Thank you very much to the West, who imposed in Libya Al-Qaeda, ISIS.
So why are you living in the United States?
I'm
If it's
living in
the
the
West's
United
fault?
States because
Okay.
All right, you guys can have this debate afterwards. Let's address.
I am going to answer.
I'm living here.
Excuse me. Let's address your question.
Okay, so your question: have I looked at Islam outside of the realm of Saudi Arabia, outside of Lebanon, outside of the Islamic world? Yes, I read the Quran from cover to cover numerous times. The Quran instructs women to cover. The Quran says that
Can you not interrupt, please? Can you please not interrupt? Let her finish.
للذكر مثل حظ الأنثيين. Isn't that?
My opinion is wrong.
Of course it's wrong. That's in the Quran. That's it. That's it. That's how I looked at it. The Quran is wrong.
Yeah. In Saudi Arabia, okay, when the prince or any of the household steals, they're okay.
Okay,
We can talk after.
I need to ask you to stop right now.
So you can talk.
I need to ask you to stop right now because this is not your platform. You posed a question and we're going to address it. And you are an audience. This is not your platform. You posed a question. Let us address it without response or interruption. Let us finish our thoughts.
And then we can move on to that. Would you want to move on to him? He wants to. He's been wondering.
Wait, no. I want to say something. We get this a lot. This whole idea that you wouldn't have this stance if you had looked outside the limited perspective of blah 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 context. You aren't familiar with the other ways of thinking and interpreting and blah blah blah. And there are reasons like Western imperialism and so on that are responsible for all of these things. And you are basically doing the wrong thing by saying what you're saying. This is presumptive, paternalistic to assume that we're speaking from a place of ignorance, that we haven't heard, digested, and reflected long upon all of these arguments, that we don't have nuanced stances that go beyond our experience, just because we happen to be speaking from a place of experience. And and especially when we are here trying to talk about and address a crucial issue, and constantly there are attempts to derail and hijack in ways that are, frankly, it would be one thing if the points had any actual merit to them. But there's this idea that, like, you're just not looking hard enough to find the progressiveness, or it's these other reasons why such things are problems. And let me tell you as a man how women actually don't have it that bad, or if you look at it in this way, it's not so. It is not the way that we should be having these conversations, but it is so often the way that these conversations are had, and we're here right now to change that, which is why we're not giving platforms to this anymore.
Can we let the gentleman speak? Yes, go ahead.
I believe she asked.
Okay, the guy's out talking.
So how does the language you use get weaponized? So, but how does the language of someone who's outside of the community of Islam or never had any relation to it, how does criticism from people, like me, who's completely outside of it, get weaponized? And sort of how is the best way for not people not inside of the community to support you?
Well, there's the basis for activism that is actually helpful is to not try to equally apply principles to both sides. And we've seen this with people who are, as Hiba mentioned, people who are kind of on the right wing, people who will say that, well, hijab is terrible, but they will kind of acknowledge that modesty is maybe a good thing, and maybe and they sort of underlie the same sort of principles. So if progressives can really look into their own values and apply them, and try to be try to have as little hypocrisy in the way that you choose to apply them as possible, that would be a really good starting point, because we don't see that on the right today, and we don't see that on the left today, and that makes political discourse impossible. So if you're going to talk about women's rights issues, talk about them in every context in which they're relevant, and show that it really is a principle that matters to you, and not that you're specifically targeting this one community.
I guess my question is a little more related to does language used by people outside of the community get weaponized inside of the community to say, oh, hey, the West is bad because they say these things? Is that?
Oh yeah, well.
Well, it really depends, in my opinion.
And my question was, I guess, what's the best way to combat that?
I guess Sarah said it all. I mean, it just depends on, oh God, it really just depends on who you're talking to is the biggest one. Know your audience would be the biggest one. I mean, it's different when you're, in a skeptic society addressing people that you think were coming here because they want to hear, people that are not religious talking about their experiences and what they believe, feminism, Islam, modesty, that sort of thing, in women's rights. And if you're talking to somebody else, you also change kind of your language when you're speaking to them. How it would be weaponized and how to avoid it, and honestly, I don't think there is a way to avoid it. It will not entirely. Sometimes you say something and then suddenly it's on Breitbart. I mean, it's something that happens.
I think maybe I might have, I don't know, do I understand your question right? You're asking how things that people outside the community are weaponized by people in the community inside the community?
Yeah.
All right. And how that can be avoided. I think the fundamental thing to acknowledge is that it is not the responsibility of people outside the community to try to use language that will not, and so as to avoid having that language be weaponized. That is a problem that has to do with the norms and values inside the community itself. Needs to be reformed from within. So to give a very concrete example, a lot of progressive and liberal values and principles are viewed as sinful, deviant, demonic, they're demonized. Just the way that the West is spoken about in some Muslim communities is like, you think people were talking about Satan himself or something. And there's no way to really get around that, because no matter how nuanced and progressive and compassionate your discourse is, it is not your responsibility to have other people avoid taking it and twisting it into their own, to fit basically their own worldview. And that is, and for that to stop happening, the change has to come from within. It has to be the way that we talk with our families when they start talking about queer people, when they start talking about trans people, when they start talking, the racism that's threaded throughout Arab communities against Black people and South Asians, just stuff like that. These are things that we need to be addressing from within, and trying to, and I feel like the purpose of discourse is not to try to fashion your terminology in a way that cannot be weaponized, because it can always be weaponized. And the issue is with the people who are doing the weaponization and why. What is underlying that? And that's pretty much an internal issue. You blue in the middle. Yeah. Yeah, you. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if any of you guys are from Iran, but you've got a network, so you might know. My perception of Iran has always been that it's got like a really kind of young population, because there's a big baby boom after that religious takeover in the 70s. And I get some notions that they are like somewhat more Western. They have a film industry. Occasionally you see Iranian independent films. from your experience talking to people, do you think there's any truth to the notion that Iran might, like the demographics in Iran might be changing to the point that you might see a little bit more westernized Iran over the coming decades, or do you think the sort of current religious paradigm there is going to persist for a while?
Well, as a person that has been to Iran a few times, even though I'm not really Iranian, you are correct in assuming that, yeah, the younger demographic is not just the younger demographic, even the demographic that participated in the '79 revolution before it was hijacked by the Ayatollahs. They are very educated. They know their rights. They know what. I'm not going to say Western, mainly because I don't know. I don't want to maybe they're liberal. They know what their rights are. They fight for them, and the bad thing about Iran is that it's a very authoritarian regime. It's very brutal. It doesn't allow dissent at all. Maybe in the next generations, but I don't think in our lifetimes, unless another revolution happens that doesn't get hijacked by religious authorities. I'm sorry, I mean, none of us here are from Iran.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question for a political analyst. I think there are far too many factors for us to actually be able to predict whether the theocracy can be upended. And the fact that there is a more progressive, newer generation is maybe a necessary but insufficient condition for that. It's just really, really hard to comment on with a prediction.
You have a question?
So I don't want to put too much of a comment before the real question, but I did want to mention, I think, because Hiba, you had said something to the end of men being blameless in Islamic society. And then you had elaborated on some other
It was Ghada, yeah.
I just wanted to throw the caveat that growing up in a Muslim household, there's a lot of impositions placed upon me, and I'm not a man, feminine identified, blah, blah, blah. But just even aside from having male gender roles assumed upon you, there was you had to not have your shorts below your knees.
Sure.
There was hiding, there was systems of control as well. So I just wanted to say, from even not being a guy growing up and not knowing it, there was a lot that was imposed. And there was a lot of possessiveness and narcissism. So I just wanted, because there are other audience members that maybe don't know that.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Put it out there. And then the question that I had is, I mean, this is obviously really difficult, but the topic and the nuance in it. But what kind of outreach or goals do you have within maybe the Muslim community, or resources or refuge, to attract people that want that support or want that ability to step outside of familial control, systems of dominance and power, but also play that line of if you're coming from a system in which even if you questioned it, you want to be accepted and then not have this harshness imposed upon it. And I guess I'm wondering, what's your audience? Do you have any resource or refuge or anything that you're trying to do within the Muslim community, or connection building in that sense? Not to try to say that you're trying to disconnect, but there's a natural schism there because of the subject matter.
Sure. So can I just clarify your last question? You said, how are we working within Muslim communities, or trying to?
Would you like to tell me anything about? And it's not saying you should be. I'm just curious, because that's what I've always been interested in. Is do you have any connections? Do you have anything else that you're trying to do, or what's your desire or outcome from this, other than promoting quality, great things?
Well, I mean, I feel like those are sufficient to be going on with at the moment. But I will say, I mean, we would love to work with Muslim communities. Unfortunately, because of the stigmatized nature of apostasy, and because of how outspoken we are about the religious roots of these issues, we find ourselves, not really welcomed within Muslim communities, even progressive Muslim communities. I mean, there's quite a few progressive activists, and I've heard this said by, I won't say who, but a very well-known progressive woman activist who said that ex-Muslims actually they're just as bad as the Taliban, because we are agreeing with the Taliban in their interpretation of Islam. So there's quite a bit of hostility that I have faced, and especially with progressive Muslims and the progressive Muslim movement, because their goals tend to be very different than ours in that their approach, not their goals, their approach tends to be very different than ours in that they will approach it by saying, well, there's actually no problems within the true interpretation of Islam. And if everyone interpreted Islam in the very peaceful way that we do, we would not see any of these problems. But of course, our message is not that at all. We're saying there are problems, and they're in the text, and they are rooted within the text, and there's a deep connection between them and the way that the religion has been practiced for millennia. So from that perspective, there is a little bit of friction there, but of course, we would love to work with progressive organizations to just further causes that we both agree with, like LGBT rights or women's rights.
Can I ask the moderates?
That being said, we don't have to work within Muslim communities to provide things to people in Muslim communities. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do with this organization. We want it to be known that if you are questioning, if you are dissenting, if you feel stuck, if you feel trapped, if you feel alone, that there is a place for you to go. There is a place for you to go where you will be accepted and welcomed and belong and assisted. Because we have people who, it's either they live in the closet or they're homeless. We have people who, we have this kind of joke where like all of us, before we started forming the organization and like became more public when we were just a small group, we're like, I thought I was the only one. Because just some things in the way that we grew up was so unthinkable to question that you feel like a deviant for even being that person who thinks that way and wants those things. And for all you know, there could be someone like you in every house. It's just that there's so much silence around it that you don't dare to speak or seek it out. The fact that there is an ex-Muslim in North America now, and we're just like, 4 years old now? If you had told me just 6 years ago that this could be a thing, I would have told you, like, you horse shit. And it's not that ex-Muslims haven't always existed. I'm sure they have always existed in every single Muslim majority society in the world since there have been Muslim majority societies. You just don't see them. The fact that we are here, and that if there is anyone who is gender nonconforming or just questioning or just doesn't feel right, doesn't feel safe, doesn't feel like the community and lifestyle they are constrained into is where they belong, and at the same time they don't feel welcome or understood in never Muslim spaces, as we call them. There is only so much acceptance and understanding you can find from people who don't have a shared background. And we provide that. We provide that in a public way so that people can reach out to us and they can have a community. Because if you are within a Muslim society and that's all you've known, that's what your family is and that's where your community is, and it's not for you, then you have no community. And we are the alternative.
I'll actually add on to that a little bit. When the organization was just coming to fruition, Muhammad is here, and this is his anecdote, but I'm going to share it. That there was a lot of pushback against the name, ex-Muslims of North America. A lot of people considered it very hostile, very aggressive, and they were like, why are you being so in your face about this? I mean, as if we were being impolite to just name the organization what we actually were. And Muhammad actually, when we were first starting, he had a conversation with this is Muhammad. He's right here. He's the president of Ex-Muslim North America. He's here helping us out. He had a conversation with a leader of a humanist organization who said, well, what do you think about changing the name to something less aggressive sounding? And he was saying this because he was thinking, well, from a marketing perspective, it's very upfront about who you are and what you stand for. But we fought for it, and we really thought long and hard about kind of like the awkward acronym and everything that we have to work with. But that we wanted to be ex-Muslims of North America. We wanted to be upfront in the name because the stigmatization of apostates makes progress impossible for everyone, including progressive Muslims. Because the first thing that anyone will say in Muslim communities when a progressive Muslim even, like someone who is, or a liberal Muslim says, well, you know, I don't know about this practice, even though it might have religious roots, we should just move on. The first thing that happens is that they get called an apostate. And then they suffer all the you know, the backlash that people like us actually do suffer. So the first step is to say that, look, there's nothing wrong with being someone who leaves a religion. There's nothing wrong with being an ex-Muslim. So that when reformers and liberals from within Muslim societies, you know, try to reform their faith from within, they don't get, you know, stuck with our label, which is just so damning and just so difficult to move forward from.
So kafir, just the word for unbeliever, just so you know, in the linguistic sense, it doesn't really have a negative connotation in the way that it's used and weaponized. It's a slur. Kafir is a slur. You call someone a kafir, you're basically dehumanizing them. You're saying that they are the worst thing that you can be. And when there are so many places in the world where people believe that apostates deserve the death penalty or violence or ostracization or whatever, this is the same principle that has been used over and over again. When what you are is basically stigmatized and used to dehumanize you, then it becomes powerful and necessary to take that and to come out front with it. Saying, no, I am not, you know, I am gonna call myself bisexual because that's a foil to heterosexual. I'm gonna call myself an atheist because that's a foil to what do you call it? The theocratic normativity of the world. We call ourselves ex-Muslims because it's a foil to the stigma and the dehumanization that comes with the concept of leaving the faith. And it's something that so many people struggle with actively. And when someone calls you a slur, you reclaim that slur. And it's kind of the same concept.
The lady at the back.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll go back to you.
Yeah, I don't know if there might be members of the audience that could answer this just as well. I don't know. I live in a part of Denver, about 2 or 3 miles from the largest mosque in Colorado, and so we have a Muslim community in the neighborhood where I live. And I see, and many of them are recent immigrants. I'm not going to get into the immigration thing. That's no, not going there. But, okay. But and I you know, just going off about my day. And at the park, for example, across the street from where I live, all summer, the women are out there with their children. The women are the complete burqas, not just the hijab, but the burqa. But the little girls, many of them have the hijab. They go to public school in Denver with other kids from other backgrounds. And I just wonder, you know, I don't really know how insular the Muslim communities are in the United States. I know there's an issue with that somewhat in the UK. But I'm hoping that the exposure to the larger, you know, to the larger community here would facilitate some sort of moderation or some sort of, I don't know. That's why I'm throwing it out to you. But I mean, I'd like to be hopeful about that.
I think exposure to alternative ways of living and kind of like interacting with the larger world definitely helps. You know, just even having just you're right, just going to school and seeing that the people around you who are of different creeds and faiths and beliefs, that they're people just like you, and they are kind, considerate, compassionate, they're humans. That does help, and I think that it's not a coincidence that a lot of us who break out, it's because we've been exposed to other ideas. And of course you can be exposed to those ideas and still, you know, cleave strongly to your own belief in your faith, and that's fine. But there's still a problem, but I think that's still radically insufficient when it comes to breaking insularity, because insularity, insularity doesn't just happen. There are mechanisms behind it. So like when I was younger, I went to an international school because my family, my father was working in Saudi Arabia, we were expats. And so I went to a school where I actually was one of the few girls who wore hijab in the entire school, you know, ironically enough. And I felt kind of like weird and stigmatized because of it. It was like, you know, mostly Canadians, Americans, Europeans in that school. And my parents were really, really intense about warning me not to get too close to the Westerners and not to give too much credence to their beliefs and not to be brainwashed by them and not to be overly friendly with them. So, and there are lots of mechanics like that where the way, because the way you interact with the public world is only a very, very small sliver of your social existence. And a lot of the time, it doesn't do much to dismantle everything else that's going on around. Which is not to say that, like, any individual needs to break away from their faith just because they're exposed to other viewpoints. That's not what I'm not endorsing that. I'm saying that in order for insularity to break, for the kind of like idea that it's wrong and bad to be anything else, and these other people, these Westerners are sinful and they're deviant and so on, exposure helps, but there also has to be change from within. There also has to be something about the sensibility, the way it's talked about, that has to come from within. So.
I actually live in your neighborhood. Yeah, we came from Denver too. Just a small comment from experience too. Our parents bring us here at a young age, and they teach us you need to take the good thing from America: education, find a job, all of that. Culture, no. We will have our own culture. We will have our own standards. We will have our own religion. And for that matter, I'm not saying that's my personal experience, but a lot of those kids get to send to a mosque during weekend to teach them Quran and Arabic. A lot of those kids wear hijab from a young age. Not necessarily the religion says a young girl should cover up, but in general, I want to teach my daughter to be conservative from that age. So when she grows up, she will not hate hijab. But then most of those kids will get exposed to other culture, other people, and some of them, like myself, will have to realize the world is bigger than what we got taught, than what our parents told us, and what we see at home. The world is bigger. Just because somebody is different doesn't make them bad, and just because somebody doesn't wear hijab doesn't make them bad, and just because someone is not a Muslim doesn't make them bad.
I'll add, that was a really good observation. Thank you for sharing. Just to add on to all of that, I think that this is why I speak so often about standing up for the rights of Muslims as citizens. It's very important that they feel comfortable and they know that America is their nation too. And if they feel that way, then they'll be more outspoken and participate more readily in American society, and they should, because that means they get exposure to different ideas, some of which may change the way that they think. And active and direct honesty has a lot to do with it, because there's so many ways, as Hiba mentioned, to just passively, hold on to the norms and the ideologies that your parents give you. So we also need to actively talk about the issues that are common in the Muslim communities, and I think we consider to some extent that we're problems that were just solved. Like, we just don't have to talk about modesty culture anymore because American women are free to a certain extent. But of course, that's not true for all Americans, and that's not true around the world either. So this is a debate that is alive, and it should be alive, and these are concepts that should always be fought for, by all women everywhere.
Sarah, you mentioned the friction that you have between progressive Muslims and their organizations like yours. Does someone like Majid Nawaz make your life harder, or is he a on the side?
These are all, I feel like all of these questions I could go on for an hour at least, but so his question was how I felt about Majid Nawaz and his work. He founded Quilliam Foundation. Is it a foundation? This organization called Quilliam, which is a counterterrorism organization. I think they started in England, and now they've expanded. Now there's a Quilliam USA as well. And his approach it's very interesting in that he is more direct than most progressive Muslims. When he talks about the problems with the religion, he'll say, here is this and this verse, and we just need to get rid of it. We just need to move on, if I'm correct in understanding his viewpoint. So I do think that there, to a certain extent, it is helpful to have that, and it's helpful to have that voice, and I absolutely support him in the same way I support a lot of liberal and progressive Muslims. However, to the extent that his perception continues to center on, well, let's work through the religious faith, let's justify secular morality through religion, I just feel like is an imposition that we don't need to have. It makes our lives more difficult. It makes it harder for me to argue for women's rights within the context of the Islam. I mean, I can twist myself into the shape of a pretzel, and I can, I can define words in 1,000 different ways. And I mean, there's just so many. There was a feminist, a Muslim feminist, who was trying to write a feminist Quran, and she was trying to define the word beat in a different way so that it can have a more feminist meaning. And she looked through, I think so many different words to finally hundreds of different definitions to find one that was less, like slightly less horrific. So it just makes the fight for progressive values, for liberal values, so much more difficult, and it makes them dependent on how loose the scripture happens to be at the time. So you're always tied down to it, and I think that this is just something that we just don't need, and I don't see any value in it. And I think we need to move past this idea that anything needs to be justified by the Quran at all. It doesn't matter what the Quran says. What matters is what's right. What matters is what supports human rights and what supports civil liberties.
Yes, the gentleman in the red.
I just want to say I think what you guys, what you three are all doing is extremely important. I come from an ex-Mormon background, and I'm pretty involved in the ex-Mormon community and family members and friends and being there for people that are questioning. So definitely, by comparison, what you three are involved in seems absolutely heroic to me. My question is, how do you balance your sanity in terms of what you do and the lifeline you are for the people and the roles you're representing, and balancing that against the things that you've left behind, the things you've given up, the family members, the relationships you've strained, the costs that come with them?
So his question is, how do you keep sane, or how do you balance between the work that we do and staying sane and doing normal things? I mean, the short answer is to do it in little bursts instead of just doing it all at once. I mean, I honestly have no idea how Sarah does this on full time. But I do it mainly whenever I can, really. I would love to help, mainly because I know how very difficult it is to be in that situation. It really helps to have somebody that is there for you, that would listen to you. And what's great about ex-Muslims in North America, you have that in the community itself, that if you need to vent, you have those people there with you. If you just want to go out for a drink and not talk about that, because that's exactly what you can do as well. So the way I balance is that I would spend some time a little bit on, trying to help, coming to these events, speaking. And when I'm not, I just concentrate on work and concentrating on just doing my readings and watch puppy videos whenever I can. That really helps.
I mean, sometimes we don't achieve sanity, but the good thing is, the wonderful thing about what we're doing is that it's draining and exhausting and just, it feels like an uphill battle, but it's also the thing that often keeps us going and energizes us. The fact that we have each other, we have this thing that we lost a lot. We lost an entire community. Many of us have lost our families, and we just built another. And what we're doing is continuing to build that. What we're doing is continuing to make it so that every new person that joins our organization, and there are new people every day, that's another person that has a safe place. And that sometimes I feel like there is nothing in the world that keeps me going other than these people. And it's both the poison and the whatever it's called, the antidote. So You already, yeah, we need to wrap up. One, okay, one more. Here.
Okay, so you guys mentioned performance feminism, and as someone who's like a liberal and identifies as a feminist, what's your biggest recommendation to people that aren't in the community to make sure that they're supporting like the freedom of religion and the freedom of expression, but not encouraging like oppression that you guys mentioned that is inside the Muslim community?
I'm all spoken out. Does someone want to take?
Just to listen. All we want is to be listened to, not to quiet us down, not to shut us down, not to put us down, not to belittle our experiences. You can tell very quickly if a person is being bigoted or if the person really has something important to say. And I understand, especially like coming from a different kind of background where you probably, I mean, I'm assuming a lot here, and you can correct me, but you probably came from a more progressive, more liberal background than I did. I'm just going out of a limb here. So, but you know, if you came to me and you asked me like how about, you know, what I wanted to talk, or Hiba or Sarah or any ex-Muslim or any Muslim woman that has a different perspective than what the media portrays, just listen. That's all I have to say.
Which is not to say that you should be passive about it and not form an opinion and not engage in critique if you feel like there's something wrong. It's the idea that, and it's funny because we're trying to tell you to decenter yourself, but also telling you to not decenter yourself, because part of the problem is how much you decenter yourself in favor of the wrong things. It's about not enabling and shutting down a discourse because you feel like it doesn't align with what you think the predominant trend in feminism is right now or whatever. I mean, because ever since the first wave, feminism is constantly reforming, constantly messes shit up, constantly, discovers that, oh, we've been throwing these people under the bus and we've been messing up in these ways. And all these ways in which we've been trying to help is causing all this damage. When we say listen, we mean let us do our work and just be perspicacious about how you listen to everyone who is talking about this from the various backgrounds. God, this is really hard to say. And the thing is that I guess listen without passing judgment, which isn't the same as listening without critique. Because you can have a very, very critical attitude that still doesn't enable one dominant narrative and shut down another, because it is true that narratives often compete with one another, and there is a such thing as narrative hegemony, and it's your job as someone who cares about this, as someone who cares about being compassionate towards a group that you're not a part of, it's your job to do your best to not jump the gun.
Last question here.
No, that's actually, that was the last question. I just wanted to, thank everyone for coming. This is we ex-Muslims of North America want to do these more often. We want to do them everywhere. If you want to know more about our organization, I think we have some brochures hanging around somewhere. Please pick one up. There's a lot of other projects that we're engaged in right now, and we're really wanting to be more active and do what we can to be a part of the dialogue. I hope you enjoyed this today. So please, if you liked it, then share our work a little bit. Just like tweet out the link. Huh?
Is there any way we can connect?
I'm not sure what that means.
Our contact information is on the brochures.
Yeah. So please take one. And thank you all for being here and for listening, because I know this was long, but I really appreciate that you were here and you were such a patient and good audience. Thank you.